Olá, pessoal, sejam muito bem-vindos à área de capacitação da Inclui PCD, a primeira feira nacional e online de inclusão de pessoas com deficiência. Meu nome é Guilherme Braga e hoje nós temos a honra de ter aqui conosco o professor Michael Stein, falando direto de Cambridge, nos Estados Unidos. O Michael é fundador e diretor executivo do projeto de empregabilidade de pessoas com deficiência da Faculdade de Direito de Harvard. O Michael é americano, então essa entrevista ela foi gravada para que a gente pudesse gerar legendas e também dar toda a acessibilidade para esse conteúdo. Então, a partir de agora, eu vou estar conversando em inglês e vocês terão aí toda a acessibilidade para poder acompanhar o evento junto conosco. Sejam muito bem-vindos. Michael, thank you so much for being with us. We are doing the first national and online job fair focused on the employment of people with disabilities in Brazil. And we are doing several interviews and bringing content to help the employment of people with disabilities. I had the honor to meet you and be physically with you almost once in a year, but to 2020, we're going to do it online, but it's great to have you here, my friend.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations, as always, on the wonderful work that you and your colleagues support, Guilherme. I'm very proud of it. It's a shining example, and I'm glad to be able to contribute whatever I can to help you move forward as you do.
Perfect, Michael. I did a very brief introduction of your work in the Harvard Law School project on disability, but I would like for you to introduce yourself to Brazil. We're going to have many people watching this interview that I told everyone that is being recorded. But I'm going to send you all the comments and questions that people will be able to do during the chat. So please tell us more about your career and how it started, the Harvard Law School project on disability.
Sure. Well, my background is as a lawyer. I have a law degree from Harvard Law School, where I became the first person with a disability to have been on the Harvard Law Review. I broke a 100-year barrier to that. And in my year, my classmate, Michelle Obama, was very supportive, and that's how I got to know that family. I've also been trained as a legal historian at Cambridge University, but my ideas of going into legal history soon got moved by the Americans with Disabilities Act and with the opportunity to advocate for persons with disabilities. And my background is in employment. So for 27 years, I've been teaching disability law and policy in various places and studying employment of people with disabilities around the world. I returned to Harvard in 2003, and we established the Harvard Law School Project on Disability in 2004, around the time that I was one of the individuals participating in the negotiation and development. Sorry, you'll have to edit that out.
Don't worry, Michael. This is happening every day all around the world. We are all home and having to deal with the pandemic. So don't worry. This is going to happen on our live events as well.
It is what it is. So I returned to Harvard Law School in 2003, and we established the Harvard Law School Project on Disability in 2004. And it arose at the time that I was one of the individuals participating in the negotiation and development of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the United Nations, the first International Disability Human Rights Treaty. Since then, it's been 16 years. I myself, as well as my colleagues, have worked in 44 countries. I've been on the ground in 44 countries, working on various policy, law, advocacy, support, work relating to people with disabilities. It ranges from very high level constitution writing and review to working with ministries on particular sectors and particular areas, to the work that we value most, working with civil society, disabled people's organizations, advocates and their families and supporters, to academic research and writing. And we try to focus on persons with intellectual disabilities, both because my partner, the Vice Dean, has been on the board of Special Olympics. He's been the lead director for over, I think, about 18 years. And because we feel it's a strong area in which to work, but we are cross disability and we work across sectors. Research wise, for better or worse, I've written more on the rights of people with disabilities than anyone else. 200 and something academic pieces. Whether any are good or not for me to say. And I continue to teach disability law and policy, not only at the Harvard Law School, but also at the Kennedy School of Government, the Harvard Medical School, where I teach bioethics, and I have a number of PhD students around the globe. So what I do academically informs what I do in the real world, and what I do in the real world informs what I think about academically.
Amazing, amazing. Um, the first time I heard about your name, um, and from knowing everything that you have done, I thought it would be really hard to speak with you. But I remember emailing, and after a few days, you quickly responded. So I guess you have to add to your resume also being a very accessible person and strongly willing to work with everyone who wants to create more inclusion around the globe. So it's a great honor to have you here with us, Michael. You mentioned that you were
Again,
the.
it's a great privilege, to be in position to be able to interact with others. And I do get my share of email every week from different parts of the world. And the ones that are genuine, like yourself, and are working every day on the ground, some of the parent groups, some individuals with disabilities who are trying very hard in very difficult circumstances are, I'm very grateful for the chance to interact with them. And then there are other, interesting emails as well.
Okay. Thank you
There's a lot of
for kind
graduate
words. Uh, you mentioned, Michael, that you were the first person with disability to get a Harvard Law School degree. Um, this
Well,
this
I
is
wasn't the first person to have a Harvard Law degree. There were many, not many, but there were those who preceded me. But I was the first to be on the Harvard Law Review.
oh the
And,
first little Harvard Law Review. Okay, okay,
and
perfect.
the world has changed a lot. I mean, many people struggle and have struggled and continue to struggle much more than I did. But it's been an interesting view to see 35 years in which, when I went to school, the classrooms were not accessible. And, I had to go up and down the stairs, drag myself up and down the stairs at the Harvard Law Review to be a member of that institution. I had to sit in the back of classrooms. I had to go through the bad weather when other people went underground in tunnels. To nowadays, when there's a whole staff in the dean's office to accommodate people with disabilities, to work with them on, obtaining jobs, to ensure that they're empowered as part of their experience. And if we look at it that way, and we reflect that The world has changed so much in 35 years. Or if we even look at a shorter period from when I was a student to when I came back to teach. And, my students, when I returned to teach, grew up in a world of inclusive education. So they saw kids with disabilities in the classrooms. There was an ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, so they expected to see people with disabilities, in the street, on the buses, in restaurants. Their perspective was totally different, and their expectations was totally different. And that was just 20 years. And in the life of a country or a society, that's dramatic. So now, we're hoping that the CRPD, which went into operation in 2008, we're now 12 years into operation, and although we have literally thousands of years of prejudice against people with disabilities, we're seeing dramatic changes too. So we're living, despite COVID, despite all the other things and all the challenges that people struggle with, we're living in a really exciting time for disability rights and for those of us with disabilities.
Perfect. Uh, we still have a lot of work to do, but I follow you in this opinion that much has changed. Um, I've been working with the inclusion of people with disabilities for the past 10 years, and I already seen a change. Imagining you talking 35 years ago, it must have been a really amazing change. You mentioned the CRPD and that you worked in the draft, in the negotiations. This was very important for Brazil. We ratified the CRPD, and it also inspired Brazil in 2015 to make the Brazilian law of inclusion. And so we use basically the principles of CRPD and adapted and added some other parts that were important here. So please tell us more on how was to build the CRPD and the importance that this law that this convention has around the world, impacting several countries and different laws.
Well, the negotiation process was a life-changing one. It also changed things at the United Nations. When we negotiated it, people with disabilities were the first group that were allowed to participate in a treaty that affected them. So preceding this treaty and coming out as soft law, as non-binding law, at the same time was the Indigenous Declaration, 25 years in the making, not involving Indigenous persons. And yet here, for the first time, the stakeholders, the people involved, could participate in the treaty, could speak at the end of every session from the floor of the UN, could register and attend the meetings. The idea of nothing about us without us came to fruition and changed the way that the UN sees things. And frankly, because of the involvement of people with disabilities, it changed the content of the convention. Everyone knows their lives better than anyone else. That's true whether or not you have a disability. So who better to ask? Who better to inform priorities and needs and necessities than the actual stakeholders? So we saw from the start there would be a large focus on legal capacity, on the ability to be recognized in the law as being equal to everyone else, to be able to make your own decisions, to express yourself, and to have those decisions honored, even if they're bad decisions, to have those decisions honored. That was a very key thing. Education was another very strong element that was being pushed. Employment has always been something very important to the disability rights community, and sadly, it's one of the areas that lags behind so very much and globally. But we'll come back to employment. It's actually one of the areas where my usual positive smile turns upside down, because we're seeing some good practices like yours, but mostly we're seeing very slow progress on it. The CRPD has changed the world. It's not an exaggeration to say that. It's changed from the top down, looking at UN programming The Millennium Development Goals from 2000 to 2015 were all about global poverty, global inclusion, and never had the word disability as part of it. Outrageous. The Sustainable Development Goals, 2015 to 2030, have 17 mentions of disability, including relating to employment. The UN has a focal point in every one of its agencies on disability. The UN is collecting data on disability. The UN is committed to hiring people with disabilities, both internally and as contractors and as outside employees. On the individual state level, there are 193 UN member states, 181, including Brazil, but not including the United States, have ratified the treaty. They've said we take it, we accept it, and it's going to control our policies. That makes it almost universal. And now states are beginning, it's only been 12 years in operation, but states are learning from each other's practices. In some ways, they're competing with each other to try to show off how they can do things. In many ways, for the first time, disability is the largest minority group in the world. And for the first time, these various countries have said, oh my goodness, we've been excluding our largest minority group forever and ever. What do we do about it? How do we include them? And hopefully the light bulb is going on about employment, because especially now after 2008 with the economic downturn, after the global recession that's coming because of COVID, states have to do more thinking and smarter thinking about how do you balance social protections and employment. How do we get people off of government benefits or lessen their reliance on government benefits and get them to be economically productive citizens? I pause to say that all citizens are valuable. We shouldn't just think about people as a means to an end, as being a dollar sign, but many governments do, and they do think about that in terms of their policies. So how do we get people off of social welfare and into the workplace? How do we make them independent? It's something that states are thinking about increasingly. The data is there now, right, about the loss to GDP, to gross domestic product, of not having disabled people in the workplace ranges in the 4 to 7% in OECD countries, and can be actually larger in low and middle income countries, or it could be higher. But at least we know for the OECD it's 4 to 7%. We now have the World Bank, which gives out $160 billion a year in loans, most of which are not loans because they're so low interest and they're often forgiven, committing to being disability inclusive. So the employment programs that they're going to sponsor, the banks that they build, the hospitals that they do, the roads, the sidewalks. By 2013, those have to be treated just like every other vulnerable population, women, indigenous, racial minorities, and have to undergo review and will have to be disability inclusive. So we're seeing a huge shift. We're seeing a big change in the way governments are doing business. And we're seeing, as in the case of Brazil with the revised national disability law, governments now coming up to speed on including people with disabilities. We're seeing governments go through the UN process of sending a state report every 4 years to the Committee on the Rights of Disabilities, reviewing it together with civil society and the committee, and receiving concluding observations, which means recommendations, on where they're going right and where they need to improve. So we're starting to see the slow bureaucracy, the slow machinery moving that way, and things are looking better. Most of all, people with disabilities are no longer invisible and no longer silenced. So the DPOs, the disabled people's organizations, the family groups, the parents who have struggled for so long in silence or not being listened to, now are recognized as having rights and equal rights and are now claiming their rights. But it's a slow process. The unfortunate truth is that every marginalized population, every vulnerable population, if you've been put down and excluded for so long, It takes a lot of energy and a lot of time to change society's views on it. But we're seeing progress. So it's a very exciting time.
Amazing, amazing. I guess the CRPD is something that has really changed around the world. How companies, governments, and other legal institutions uh, talk about the inclusion of people with disabilities. And in Brazil, uh, by ratifying the CRPD, this has a constitutional amendment power. So it's a very important law here in Brazil, being ratified that, and something that has come up again during the the draft of the Brazilian National Law of Inclusion. You mentioned that your smile turns upside down when you talk about employment, but during this week here in Inclui PCD, we're trying to bring good news. We're trying to bring positive vibrations and helping people with disabilities with content and also with job opportunities. So you mentioned that you've been in the ground of 44 different countries. What could you share with us that are successful cases of the employment of people with disabilities around the world?
It's a wonderful question and a very difficult question as well. But to underscore for these people who are participating in your National Employment Week, right? You have 100,000 people. You know, the U.S. is 1.5 times the size of Brazil, and the most we've ever had as far as a resume pool was at the beginning of the Obama administration, because the Obama, all federal governments in the U.S. have been under an affirmative action policy to hire people with disabilities. And the Obama administration reached an all-time high of roughly 2%. That was it. But we had a resume pool of 30,000 people. That's the most the U.S. has ever done. You'll be getting close to 100,000 people in Brazil, with the country two-thirds the size. So I hope you're feeling good about that. What are some good things that have come out? There are a number of areas where states have been successful. One is this federal hiring idea. And although the U.S. only reached 2%, there are some countries that have goals of 10% across their federal governments. Many countries, are more in the 5% range, like Israel is a 5% range, although a much smaller country. It's a very positive effort because it means not only that the government wants to encourage the hiring of people with disabilities, but that it walks the walk, right? It shows its own example and it follows it. So that's always been a good policy. Quotas, have very mixed history, depending upon how much governments are committed to enforcing them. In Brazil, you had the history early on that looked like many other countries, where there was a quota and there was monitoring and there was audits, but there was no bite. And the closest we have to that in the U.S., where quotas are illegal, is a 7% goal for those who receive federal contracts, and which there's a very, very small office that will do reviews and offer good policy recommendations. The same for Canada, which the Human Rights Commission will do audits on on an anonymous and rotating basis, but no bite. Brazil, as we know, when it came back and said, okay, you've had a couple of years, now it's time to actually do it, and start issuing out fines and put some bite into it, is where we see progress with quotas. Now, we can have a philosophical discussion about, is any job good enough, and is the person working at their full capacity and flourishing? But the fact of the matter is, being employed is a great thing, and it's a very positive for people with disabilities. We've seen some mediocre practices and quotas as well. in places like Germany and France where there is not enforcement of those quotas. And again, we've seen interesting ones like Japan and Korea, where not only is there enforcement of the fines, but there's also a government agency that will take the fines and work with the private sector in cooperative ways, create public-private partnerships to employ people with disabilities. So that's a good practice as well. Another good practice which exists is called um, government procurement contracts, and there is very, very little evidence. It may exist, but there's very, very little evidence on how much it exists within the disability sector. That sounds like a complicated name, but basically the idea is every government, whether it's a national one or it's a state or a province or even a local city, will buy things and contract for services, whether it's people who clean the office at night, whether it's ordering in lunches, whether it's having a limousine service that takes people and guests back and forth to the airport, whatever it is, governments contract with many, many different organizations and service providers. If those contracts go to people with disabilities in a competitive way, in other words, we could give it to other groups as well, LGBTQI, indigenous groups, racial groups. But if we choose to empower those groups, and if they have a competitive bid, then we're doing a lot not only on employment, but also on creating capital and creating, empowerment for those groups. It's an enormously productive way of doing it. There is very little evidence on how much it affects the group of people with disabilities. That's something we'd like to see more of. Then there are, public-private partnerships that do things like create a resource bank for reasonable accommodations in the workplace. There are job set-asides, which have an interesting and not even history. So, it's good to have blind massage, but do we want every blind person to only be able to do massage? So there are a number of practices that vary from place to place. Tax incentives are always good if they're monitored. We have very generous tax incentives in the US, both for employers hiring individuals with disabilities and for employers fixing their physical plant to accommodate workers and also customers with disabilities. All the evidence from the General Accounting Office indicates they're not used at all. But in other countries, those tax incentives, those subsidies are used and have been effective. In groups that are harder to employ, for example, individuals with intellectual disabilities, individuals sometimes with psychosocial disabilities, those with more complex physical needs, there are practices such as job coaches, there are practices such as internships. Developing relationships with companies is always a good thing. There are practices in some countries of having off the record, non confrontational engagements of companies with either people with disabilities or intermediaries and NGOs like yourself, where human resource managers can ask questions they don't want to ask in public. Things ranging from how does someone in a wheelchair go to the toilet to what happens if I hire someone with schizophrenia and they need time to make the voices quiet down to, what happens if we have to fire this individual? What happens if it just doesn't work? How do we handle this? Is it any different than with other employees? And these questions are in the back of people's minds. Because of politeness and other things, they very often don't voice it. And so what we see in terms of gross numbers and gross stories, we see lots of CEOs who talk about employing people with disabilities, and many of them, I believe it. But something happens between not a lot of people applying for jobs or people applying for jobs, and then you look at the numbers that are employed at the end, and it's a very different figure from the number of applicants to employed individuals in the non-disability sector. And there's that black box that goes through. And I think a lot of the black box are these concerns, stigmas, unasked questions where a human resource manager says, you know what, we've got so many people applying for jobs, we don't need to have the trouble. We don't need to have, potential liability. We don't need to have issues. As opposed to human resource managers saying, you know what, the person who just applied to the job is blind. She had to get into public transportation that was not accessible. She had to figure out how to get here on her own. She's a problem solver. That's the sort of person I want. So that black box is one where we have to look really carefully and try to work on. Anyway, those are some good practices. For people who are curious about both state-sponsored practices and practices by individual corporations, you can go to, for example, the Zero Project, easy to Google.
Mhm.
And, I'm on their scientific board, as are many others. They will publish good policies and practices, both public and private. This year, in February, they will publish their private corporations' best practices. And we'll all get a sense. I've been able to see some, I'm not supposed to share it now, but I've been able to see some from the scientific committee. We'll be able to look at it. What's notable, and I just stepped down from the board of the National Organization on Disability, where I sat for 12 years, is that working with the Fortune 500 in the Western world, in the US, the best policies in private corporations here in the developed world are maybe, 2%, maybe 2%. Global population of persons with disabilities, 15%. US population, closer to 19%. We had a 1% unemployment rate for a long time before COVID hit, and we were not going back to the disability sector to fill those jobs. So there's still work to be done. That's why the smile goes this way. And that's why I love being able to support good work like this.
Amazing. Yes, when we talk about the employment of people with disabilities, here in talk, there are several different areas that is connected. So we have public transportation, accessibility, we have cultural aspects and how people deal with the inclusion of people with disabilities. And one good thing that we sense here in Brazil is that we are able to talk more about the inclusion of people with disabilities. And during the pandemic, we have been connecting online, but having a great audience and a great number of people talking about the inclusion. So it's a very complex process to make the employment, but also very rewarding when we're able to do that. And I guess Brazil, you had the opportunity to meet with Carlos, that is going to
Okay.
be here with us this week as well, representing the Ministry of Labor here in Brazil. And we have great auditors, very committed to the employment of people with disabilities, working around the whole country, making connections and helping companies to employ more people with disabilities.
Yeah, the COVID-19 has been interesting. It's been horrific, of course. But on the employment issue, it's been interesting because for many, many years, people with disabilities and their advocates have argued that telecommuting was a form of accommodation. And it's not perfect because it means that you're not interacting with your coworkers physically in the same space. So it's not as good in breaking down barriers. But let's say you and I are on video together a few times a week. You could see that I don't have three heads, and I'm not green skinned and whatever have you. And for many years, companies have resisted it and said, no, no, it's impossible. You can't perform your job the way you need to unless you're here. Well, once COVID hit, everything turned upside down. And it's going to be very interesting to see, first of all, generally, what happens to the idea that you need to go somewhere and be in an office and have FaceTime and just generally. And secondly, what happens to the idea of telecommuting? Whether we're going to, I don't think we're going back to what it was before. But the question is, how much in between these two extremes will we see? And the impact it might have very positively for people with disabilities.
You were talking one of the positive sides uh,
Trying to.
about companies thinking differently about well the employment of everyone, but this has an important part with people with disabilities. We created this week because we saw a very negative impact on the number of job opportunities for people with disabilities since COVID hit Brazil around the middle of March. Around March 15 is where we started some social distancing. Um, you mentioned this positive impact. What do you think we should be aware during the pandemic so we don't go back in many steps that we are going forward in the employment of people with disabilities?
Well, we have to make sure that we don't return to the world of last in, first out. That we're going to ignore disability as a sector from which we can draw productive potential employees. Because we did not see an increase, so far as I know, of disabled employees during COVID. What we saw was the telecommuting of existing employees. We didn't see them entering the workforce after the 2008 downturn. We haven't seen them, and now it's going to be questionable as to will people with disabilities be re-entering the workforce, and will they now be considered a more viable alternative or population on which to look at. Businesses went back to the old way of thinking. When they needed to hire part-time people or full-time people with COVID, they looked to retirees and to others with workplace experience, and you could see the value of that. But they didn't. No one really thought, this is a great time to hire people with disabilities. So now with COVID, hopefully soon, one day, returning us to something like normal, will the population be at the front or at the back of the line? That's what we have to be careful about.
Great. We're reaching the end of our talk, Michael, and you are a very inspiring person from all the work that you have done, um, academic and also in the real world, having great impact for people with disabilities all around the world. I would like to ask you, what could you say for people that right now are unemployed? And it's common to not feel very well during these hard times. But what would be your message for people with disabilities that are looking for a job opportunity now here in Brazil?
It's not easy. I don't have any simple answers. I have great empathy, and it's not easy. We all have to remain resilient and determined and positive because those are traits that employers and others find valuable. We can be very frustrated, but we can't come across as being embittered and negative. We have to show people how we are problem solvers and good team players and positive influences on workplaces. And sometimes it means we have to bang our heads against the wall many, 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 many times. And if it helps to think about it in this way. You may be seeing me speaking to you from Harvard University, and obviously I have some good credentials, etc. Um, but it was not easy becoming a law professor. I had all kinds of prejudice and strange questions asked to me. And so, although I'm very, very privileged, um, the fact of the matter is we all experience discrimination. It never feels good. It's very frustrating. We all want to be employed and to be independent and to be able to make our own way in the world. And one of the ways to do that is to remain upbeat and to remain positive and to be assertive in a positive way about why you would be a good employee and why you deserve a chance to show what a good employee that you can be.
Great. Thank you so much again, Michael, for your time, for being with us here during this week. It's going to be a great privilege for Brazil to get to know you better. So thank you so much for your time, and it has been an honor to have you here.
Thank you for having me. And congratulations and good luck.
Thank you so much.